So the recording has now started. Hello, everyone, and hello, anyone that's listening later. And greetings, Thaddeus. And great. Today begins something it's a little bit of a rename, but a little bit of a reframe of what we'll be doing on the webinars, right? Where we'll have discussion and possibly, depending on time, multiple people can come on audio if they'd like and talk. I might share some things or just work some things I had planned to share as it's relevant in people's questions. And terrific. So we'll call this the mastery discussion. This is kind of what we'll do live for now. I might skip a webinar meeting one that would normally come up in 2 weeks at some point soon, just to kind of particularly focus on getting the definitive series off the ground. But we'll see. You can check in on that over time next week. Okay, all right, wonderful. So we have Matai on, who had just before I hit the record button, said he'd been waiting and preparing 6 years for this to be on live. So it's wonderful to have you on. Are you in Romania?
Yeah, I'm in Romania.
Awesome.
Yeah, I studied in England, came back home in Romania, and my plan is to come to the United States someday.
Okay.
And you guys there. I've had a lot of existential thoughts about how things work, what's subjective, what's objective, what's reality, is all of this an illusion? At about 24 years old, I was like lost into reading all those books, figuring out all those things, philosophically speaking. And then, once I heard you for the first time, I got so relaxed. I couldn't sleep for like a couple of nights, listening to you continuously, because you seemed to shed so much clarity, like take every single notion and build upon it without gray zones. And I immediately felt that. So I've been desperate all my life for this, and I've been questioning right and left, why don't people look into this, right? Why is why aren't people thinking about their
Like when we
reality?
talk about bottlenecks in the first definitive series that I did live, why don't people realize that the bottleneck has to involve, figuring out basic questions, right? Like it's not like everyone's minds are giving them just the right conclusions. And if that's the case, then we need to address that first, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like people are always at the surface level where they're doing practical stuff, engineering, but then if you go to the sciences, you have an advantage over them. But then the people that do mathematics, they have an advantage of people that, well, it depends. I mean, the one that controls the outermost context has the advantage over the others. So
like an Othello.
Yeah. So when you came and you talked about how we can understand and how can we know things, like what is true understanding, what's absolute truths, I knew that has to be the basis through which we can construct everything. And yeah, that is the hack to life, and that's more valuable than the $10 million that you're saying in alchemy.
For alchemy.
Your teachings are, to a billionaire, they're worth even hundreds of millions of dollars.
Thank you. If you have the money, it's worth a lot. I of course I appreciate it very much, and I agree. Mike Long and myself, we'd be walking and thinking about this back in our 20s, and how we wanted. I was kind of early on in discovering things, but it was still great progress, and just the idea of learning to measure progress by seeking understanding, and and also looking to address the fundamental question of, well, how do we know what's true, and then working from there, and really realizing and feeling how practical that is. And then we proved it, right? We set out, we wanted to make some money for sure, but we also wanted to kind of, it was early on in the internet, and we realized the internet was hardly existed in any kind of relevant way or way that we were aware of when we first were thinking we wanted to spread things, and then it was started to come about, and yeah, we wanted to. And yeah, anyway, what you're saying kind of reminds me of those days, right? And we would be walking like on the campus of UVA just because it was near where I lived, and it was kind of beautiful. And it was also like the corner and food and stuff there. But we'd be like looking out and like thinking that even at that time, which was over 20 years ago, was it 20? Yeah, I'm 48 now, and I was in my like our mid. We were in our mid 20s, right? So over 20 years ago, almost 25 years ago, when it was even at that time like felt more valuable than like the combined knowledge of all the professors there, right? Or that we could really succeed just in a practical level, just based on the methods and so forth, or what we call the method, even though it was a little bit ill-defined, but still just the kind of method of seeking understanding as measuring progress, and that doesn't prevent action or anything, but it kind of guides action. And then here we are today.
Yeah, like you talked about how progress is a mental object, and then if we can recreate, like if we can create our mental objects properly, we can like if we construct progress in a more effective way, or in the best way, in the real sense, then we can pursue real progress. But by default, we have a sense of arbitrary progress, right? So by default, we operate on a consciousness screen that's full of arbitrary things, right? And you, instead of fighting with the fire and putting up effort, you try to redefine the mental constructs and then navigate easily with that. So
Yeah, that's a fine way to put it. For a new person, they might not know what we're talking about very well, of course, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when we say that, but yeah, I mean, uh, even the simple application. Of course, I don't want to stop at the simple application, but even at the simple application of just, um, uh, yeah, again, like measuring progress through like the seeking of gaining understanding, whether that means we've spent 2 hours trying to figure out how to make a website on WordPress and didn't feel like we made a lot of progress with getting the website up. When you reframe it in terms of seeking understanding, you understand that apparently you had to go through that, and you might still, not be like that content with that situation, or you might be if you're particularly far along with feeling, progress is understanding. But anyway, yeah, somehow it just kind of constantly um, helped us to take the right actions, look at things the right way, look at relationships the right way, develop them, the right way, and keep succeeding.
You said that your way of controlling the mind is you control your goalscape. Controlling the goalscape is the most fundamental way you could influence your mind. And my question is that more fundamental than redefining the frames that you have? Because if you redefine the frames, then you redefine your mental objects in your consciousness screen. And if you redefine your mental objects, then the goalscape becomes redefined. So it's a question of which one is first, the egg or the chicken. So which one is first, redefining frames or redefining the goalscape?
Now, I myself have been a little bit use slightly different meanings for things like goalscape, which is just my fault, kind of, or kind of a progress and perhaps in how I kind of came to, organize things. But probably the answer is frames. Yeah, I agree. Like I'm sure we're pretty much in agreement or understand about the same thing, where whatever is kind of the deepest magnet, right? Or the place to stand. There's different. We're being a little bit metaphorical, right? We talk about standing or magnets, but if in the metaphor you're standing somewhere that allows you to figure out the right magnet, then the place you're standing is, I suppose, primary, and the magnet comes afterwards. But they kind of, logically flow from each other. Um, uh, Let me address something similar, which is, suppose you're thinking, all right, I'm focused in a certain place. Is this foundational? Like it's important. Like I'm thinking about not just what my goals are or even what I want my goals to be, but I'm thinking about how, so if we're thinking about what we want our goals to be, then we can sort of do that right or wrong, like with a lot of things. We can, one of the things I wanted to mention today, and that I think I typed and you said that it related to your questions, was there's a kind of a core skill, I would say, with law of implication for all of us. And that is, it's kind of both a starting place and in a certain sense, not an ending place, but kind of it's both a starting place and a place that can take us through to mastery, is as we increase our skill at distinguishing between our minds, or our minds, doesn't really matter, between conclusions and the like raw data, raw experience, and so forth. You could still feel and be aware of the conclusion, but be aware of it as distinct from the again, like the raw experience, the raw information. I could try to give an example in a moment, but that parallels the skill or idea of, it's not the exact same thing, but it goes quite hand in hand with distinguishing between what you do consciously and what your mind has to do. Like, and as a kind of a simple starting point, any kind of processing or creation of thoughts, like origination of thoughts and so forth, is going to come from your mind. But anything that where it's necessary to experience something consciously has got to come from you. And as your mind processes anything that involves consciousness, like knowledge, love, goodness, should, it's got to twist it to like a sanitized, so to speak, a version where the consciousness kind of stripped out or re-understood or re-encoded as something that is different than actual consciousness, since your mind isn't conscious and doesn't have any experience of being conscious, so to speak. Okay, but let me get back to, so what you're asking is, all right, do I focus on the goalscape? And let me reorient myself to even what I myself mean when I talk about goalscape. What was my last, I don't have it to pull up right here, which I wish I did. But do you remember the last kind of organizational scheme? I remember the slide, but I don't have it totally at the tip of my mind what exactly I said. I know there was 5 levels, and I had kind of a dividing line after the 3rd level and before the last 2.
It wasn't about bottlenecks, right?
Say again?
Was it about bottlenecks?
Oh, no. This was about when I had the goalscape and so forth. I can probably recall approximately what was on there because it's based on what I actually do and think. So it's not like I came up with that as kind of a fake scheme. But sometimes I might forget just kind of how I phrase something.
Is or
Say again?
the seems versus is the first level?
Yeah, not that one. It was the one that had goalscape and like maybe on it, and then the norms and standards, invisible mindscape. Yeah, actually, that one. It had invisible mindscape on it. Powdered. Yeah, like the powdered milk. Exactly. That's what I talk about. How the mind has to get rid of the consciousness part to process things like love and knowledge and good. Right. The norms and standards mostly invisible. Was that like the 4th line, and then the 5th, the bottom might be, yeah, the most foundational concepts, like the Brent's just going to tell me, so I'll wait, I think. Or bottom was, yeah, like foundational. Was there something underneath? Okay. Yeah, there was something between the bottom and norms and standards, maybe, or besides foundation. Yeah, so Um, oh my God, you're. This is why I love you guys. Okay, so Joseph just put it right there on the screen. All right. Um, don't type guys for a second, or I can just scroll up and keep it here. That you can type, but I'll just have it scrolled up now. Okay, so more momentum. Okay, so landscape, mindscape, goalscape, mostly invisible mindscape, right, and then foundations. Okay, super. So if we take a look at this, then um, I I wrote that like, so when you're in a flow state, which is desirable, right? A flow state is when you're not really noticing time, you're kind of into what you're doing, there's kind of a proper level of challenge. There's enough where it's not like, doesn't feel like kind of too repetitive or boring, you're kind of into what you're doing. But there aren't signals coming up or anxiety or thoughts where that you need to kind of step back and rethink about like your general plan or course of action. This is desirable. It is great. It's a nice state of mind, and there's nothing wrong with it. There is something wrong with it, of course. There's something wrong if there's something wrong, right? So we can act in flow that has all kinds of benefits as long as we're on the right track, right? And so one way of looking at kind of a successful life or project is you want to figure out, how do I get like those bottom 4 layers right um, as effectively and efficiently as possible, and then you might be able to spend most of your time in a flow state just finishing up what you're doing, just kind of in essence you've already won with the lower 4 levels, and then you're just winning, right? So it's fun to spend most of your time in life just sort of winning after you've gotten everything straightened out. And so then as we go below this, what I called mindscape was when somebody is more like in their head and thinking about what to do, right? So we're trying to get to the top in a certain sense, right? But we're trying to also do the bottom part directly, and people tend to not do the bottom two, especially they don't do these properly, and that kind of messes up the whole thing. All right, they can still get into flow, and that flow can still be in the right place sometimes, but then there's other things in their life that are all out of whack, because they're not able to really get things fixed properly with the bottom. um, so so again, what I labeled mindscape here is where you're kind of planning and thinking about what to do. But when you're planning and thinking, if that's the lowest you get to in this scheme, then, or the deepest you get to, then of course your planning and thinking is going to be pretty constrained, right? Without you being particularly aware of it. And a lot of planning, when people do it, ends up being, like I've talked about recently, like a checklist of what is supposed to go right. Or it is very, in essence, metaphorical, meaning your mind goes and thinks about what happened similarly in the past that you dealt with, and then it too much cut and pastes that into your new plan for this new situation, and then you're not going to be taking, or you or your mind is not going to be taking into account what might be new, and you're not really looking at things with fresh eyes, right? Looking at things with fresh eyes kind of goes hand in hand with that core skill I'm talking about, where you're able to look at the raw data. Like you can look and say, oh, this situation, this sales letter I'm writing, or this sales call I'm going to do, or this SEO project, or whatever it is you're doing, or this date with somebody. Oh, it's just like if you think, well, it's just like this other date I went on, or it's like every day, or you kind of you might not say those words, but your mind might kind of be feeling that, like, oh, I'm going on a date, and that terminology is used for your previous dates as well, so it kind of categorizes it, right? And once your mind categorizes something, then it's like it's making a metaphor or like a cut and paste, right? And the planning is going to be based on memory and like I think you can get what I'm saying. So the idea that something that's analogous or categorized the same as past events that you've done, the idea that this new event is similar or the same or needs to have the same planning or what people call strategy or plan of action, that idea that, okay, this plan will work again, right, is a conclusion. And that idea that might not be specified. You might just be doing something like by rote, right? Like where you go and do something like go on a date or do a project or do a sales call or a sales letter or whatever. the same as if it was the same as previous ones. And the idea that it's the same, right, again, is a conclusion. The memory of previous potentially similar events, previous dates, previous sales calls, etc., previous similar projects, that memory is like the raw data or raw experience. Those memories are useful. The conclusion that this seems similar is a conclusion. The conclusion itself can be looked at as raw data in a certain sense, right? But feeling and rubber stamping the conclusion, that's what you don't want to do. So you can be aware that your mind's giving you a conclusion without accepting the conclusion like as a conclusion, right? And that's the skill we want to build up. Like that's going to go hand in hand with what I've called seeking understanding. It's going to go hand in hand with working properly with your mind and seeing how to do that better and better. And then it's going to go hand in hand with just a lot of success where you're looking at things with fresh eyes while still getting all the benefit of your past experience. But you're tailoring your, each new, like there's almost a, I don't know, almost, but like in Zen Buddhism, there's an idea called, what I think it's called right thinking. But where you're coming at things in a certain fresh way, but you of course aren't forgetting about the past, but you're not rubber stamping conclusions. Just to kind of quickly go through here to address Mahai's question. So goalscape. So deeper than planning and thinking about what to do is thinking about, well, is this task the most important task? Like instead of just planning how to do something, I'm thinking, is this what I want to do? Is it where I want to put my resources? Am I just sort of reacting to something that feels important because there's someone close by nagging me about it? Or I just feel like I should do it for some vague reason. But is it really the thing that's going to have the most impact, right, on my life? And maybe it is. Maybe you're correct, or your intuition's correct. Maybe you're not. And so the exercise that sometimes occurs in self-improvement things, or a motivational speaker might do it, or something like that. They might say, okay, first write down like what you want to accomplish, like in the next year or 5 years, and then order them in the order of priority, that sort of thing, right? So you're kind of reflecting and being explicit about what your priorities are and what things you want and what you want your goals to be, right? Another way of phrasing it might be that someone says, well, write down your goals, and then someone says, well, those might be like your goals that you first write down, but then stop and think about what you really want your goals to be, right? And then you might reflect and you might change your list of what you want what your goals are based on just a little bit of reflection. Okay, so that's going down to that third level there. I know I've covered this in the webinar that Joseph pulled this from, but just kind of going over it to try to orient ourselves and address what Mahai is saying. So then what I said is when we do that exercise of listing what we want our goals to be or what we think our goals should be, then that's still going to come from somewhere, right? And we're dealing on that when we're dealing on the third level, we're kind of, that's where our attention is. And so we're not really aware of where our thoughts about what we want our goals to be, or like why or where those are coming from. We just sort of feel them, like, yeah, these feel important. This is what I want. But the reason you want what you want comes from something that's actually fairly arbitrary in one sense. It's understandable, it's predictable, so it's not random, but it's arbitrary in the sense that, and this brings us to a very radically practically important idea, which is this idea of norms and standards, right? And I wrote beliefs and wounds there too. But one way or the other, your goals are coming from this kind of layer of your mind that gets formed by looking at your peer group. It kind of has this idea of like what's normal. What was an example of something recently where, oh, I know. I just, one of the things I just think about kind of randomly, it's of varying importance to different people, I suppose, but within Christianity, it's kind of, in one sense, shocking to me that Paul, the apostle, I mentioned this, but I'm just giving this as an example about what I'm talking about, but it'll be a familiar example. But how is it that it's just so pervasive in Christianity that Paul, when he wrote to various churches, is treated as if he's God in the sense of being infallible? Like in the one hand, Christians will say, well, Paul's not God, but on the other hand, they'll say, let's look at God's word, right, and go look at writings Paul did. And this is something where, like, Christianity, just the name of it, right, it's based on following Christ, and Christ never met Paul, never mentioned Paul. Everyone knows there was a Council of Nicaea, in the, like, around in the 200s, I think, of AD, and they might have been reasonable men. Like if you're coming up with sort of, if you're asking a different sort of question, like which writings are going to be treated as like by pretty great people or important people in the Christian faith, Paul and Jesus' brother and Peter, like those are pretty good examples, and the stuff they left out is pretty reasonable to leave out. So they did an okay job with the type of thing they're asking. But if the question is who's infallible and who's treated as God, it's just a nonsense question for anyone to be addressing in the year 200 AD or any time, right? You would need some massively anomalous situation where you're pretty much down to Jesus as a potential anomaly large enough to think of those things, right? With Paul didn't claim to be God. There's just nothing connecting Paul to being infallible or God. And yet pervasively Christian, and I'm delving into this briefly with detail just because it illustrates the norms and standards, like concepts. So sometimes I'll just delve into something regardless of how important the example itself is to somebody, just to really illustrate this norms and standards thing. So it's such a nonsense belief. Just if you look at it with fresh eyes, Paul being God or tantamount to God or infallible is just a ridiculous concept. The idea that, and then it's believed and acted on by virtually every Christian in practice. Again, for no real reason, because being a Christian should mean you're trying your best to follow Christ or that sort of thing. You believe that that Jesus might be God or God's avatar or God's son. But why the deification of Paul? It just seems like obvious idolatry, right? And just counterproductive in every way. And Paul said, like, among other things, at least two really over the top crazy things. One is that it's basically the divine right of kings, where authorities are put in place by God, and we basically are supposed to obey them, right? No matter what, right? Hitler, Taliban, Joe Biden, whoever, right? Just obey. And they're like put in place by God. And Paul also was pretty clear that homosexuality is just wrong, right? And like morally wrong against Christianity and so forth. And both of those are really, really impactful in terms of the negative consequences. And Jesus, didn't say anything, of the sort. So this normal, but so on the one hand, it should be so clear, at least to some significant amount of Christians, that this makes no sense to deify Paul, to idolatrize Paul, basically. And yet, because it's normal, it's so difficult. It feel like for Christians to grasp this, and I think on an individual level they sometimes do, or if people are on my webinars otherwise have respect for me, and then I kind of explain them. I'd say, wow, I didn't think of it that way, right? Some might be turned off by me mentioning it or be bothered. I don't really know. No one's told me that they have. I would guess that some might be. But anyway, so that's just a random example of how norms, right? Like I would think that, like, yeah, I feel like there's something really on the surface totally bizarre about electing someone with dementia, senile dementia, as president of the United States. But again, the incredible normalcy of it during the election time, it was made you just feel very normal to vote for such a person. But it seems like like when you step back from it. On the other hand, if it was between, I myself might have done so if it was, the constituency and the party is just so practically important in America. So I don't know. But in the primary, that's the utterly bizarre thing, right? Is in the primary, I don't get it, right? That should just never happen in a primary. That someone with dementia is picked. It's just very, very strange. So, All right, let me kind of wrap up my soliloquy, my monologue here, and get it back to discussion, just kind of tie things together. So as we can examine the norms and standards in our mind, more we want to understand the concept and just find a way deeper to like let go rather than trying to play whack-a-mole with every thing that feels normal. It's not like I want you to, we should feel like every normal thing is abnormal, right? Not at all. As a matter of fact, if something is normally believed, I'll believe it too, unless and until there's an anomaly. It's the anomalies that uh, are critical here. I think sometimes about my discussion with Mike Broadwell and how or what I could figure out, what I could explain so that it would be easier for LOI people to resolve issues like that or to not like one of the things I think about is anomalies and how um, I don't really see, and the things that he brought up, I don't really see anomalies that that would that are relevant when it comes to that viruses just basically don't exist, period, in the world, and it's sort of a made up thing by everyone or doctors or researchers or something, and that vaccines as well basically don't exist or work, and that cyanide maybe is what killed people that are dying of COVID. Like I don't see any anomalies that point to that. Like everything about by contrast, there was a time when it was you censored, by the government and pseudo government entities like Facebook and so forth, if you said that the virus originated from the Wuhan lab. But the idea that the virus originated from the Wuhan lab is just sort of common sense as an alternative, like as a potential theory. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's just like, okay, so a lab that does research on viruses would sometimes we try to do some gain of function research and the virus can get out. Like that's not, that's not something where it's crazy. But the idea that every virus researcher around the world is making it up, right? And someone might say, well, what about like climate change? Well, there's so many ways in which the so-called consensus about man-made climate change is, and I don't even need to prove this. You can just probably disagree with me, but either way, you can. I mean, you very well already agree with me, and then you can just think it through. But as I look at them, there's all sorts of motivations that make sense for why scientists would fall in line with the idea of man-made climate change. And there's also just prediction after prediction with climate change that are opposites of each other or that simply don't come true anywhere. Like there's just doomsday predictions that have already passed. The practitioners of it either act like they don't believe in it in the least by flying around in private jets all over the place, or they'd enrich the heck out of themselves with Al Gore, making $100 million off of something or other to do with climate change somehow. And then there are plenty of dissenting, scientists. I'm sure with viruses, I guess there's scientists that say viruses don't exist. I don't really come across them. But anyway, the kind of it's such a coherent idea without anomalies. That the basic idea that viruses exist, make people sick sometimes. The coronavirus exists as a virus that sometimes kills people and to the extent that it's relevant, the number of people that die. And also, furthermore, that vaccines are a relevant part of the solution and can make a significant difference. And it's turning out in this case that they, like in terms of at least hospitalization, right? Whether or not it fully prevents someone from getting sick, obviously it doesn't. But this I know I'm continuing on here rather than stopping. But and then this takes me again back to this idea where learning how to distinguish conclusions from raw data, learning how to treat anomalies or the lack thereof, versus what Mike Broadwell, who I respect greatly, what he brought up is kind of thinking of like the core LOI concept that his conclusions followed from was looking in context, like not just believing what they tell you and looking around in context. And looking around in context is certainly important, relevant skill. But I think deeper and even more important is this separating out our conclusions from the data and somehow looking at things that way. One more contrasting thing, when the reason I'll bring up Hiroshima and Nagasaki sometimes is that it's an example of an anomaly that is so clear and important that it blows apart a worldview. And it only takes one anomaly to blow apart a worldview, right? But the intentional burning alive of thousands of little children while they're in their mother's arms is, and having basically no remorse and pretty much pride about that, is defining. Like it can't be, like dismissing it itself doesn't really make any sense. And so a person's worldview about government, the United States, the military, any of these things, it has that, like that can't be dismissed, right? It needs to be taken into account, one way or the other. So anyway, that's kind of an example of an anomaly that sort of woke me up to it in a certain way. Okay, and then foundations and ultimate frames comes down to Mahai's question. I did have this deeper, right? You want to get those right because instead of playing whack-a-mole with norms and our beliefs and so forth, when we have the most basic ideas straight, like the idea that, you know, ultimately there's one goal and the rest is bottlenecks, as I expressed it a month ago, with wanting, you know, the best possible value experience for everybody. That has nothing to do with greater good. I don't mean that in aggregate you want the best possible experience and you can do that by sacrificing some number of people, right? What I mean is, of course, we just want to, for each individual person to have their valued experience be high. Okay, Mahai, why don't I let you come in? I didn't fully, I don't think, answer your question. I kind of gave thoughts related to it. So maybe you can kind of clarify what you're still asking about, and then I can kind of bring that to a better, more satisfying close.
Yeah, so the difference between us seeing all the external stimuli that you know, our senses pick up on, and the scenario which we have right now, which is seeing a limited consciousness screen, is, you said in the past, a reality construct. So is the totality of our frames the reality construct by definition?
Oh, is it? Did you say is the totality of our reality construct frames, or did you say the opposite?
Is the totality of the frames in our mind our reality construct?
In essence, so let me just review for people and explain the question a bit. So our mind create and once I explain it, it'll be kind of obvious what I'm saying. Our mind has to obviously create a model of the world, and both a model of the world, our place in it, and then our what's good, right? Like it's not just a physical model of the world, but our mind creates a sense that of who we are, our place in it, and then like what we should do, right, or what we're trying to do, and all kinds of related things, like how much luck there is in the world, how much it's rigged against us or for us, and how safe the world is, and all sorts of things like that. Whether God exists, so there's a kind of deep ideas whether God exists, whether the nature of God, who we are, again, what's normal, all kinds of things, what to expect from other people, what people owe us, all that stuff forms what I would call our reality construct, right? Our kind of total model of the world and our beliefs about, and our mind's beliefs about the world and so forth. So yeah, that would include foundational ideas and ultimate frames, like the 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 four terms of knowledge and identity. Those kind of go together. How we know what's true and like who we are, like the um, and knowledge, identity, and then there's like power and goals, right? Knowledge, identity, power, and goals. Those are at least four major like ultimate, or they point to four kind of ultimate frames or understandings about things, right? Power is like your, along with your free will, just to kind of explain what I mean by that. Um, so so that would be part of your, like your reality construct in your mind, and you would want to get those. The more those are understood accurately, the more those kind of conform, metaphorically speaking, like the corners on the Othello board or something, right? If you guys know Othello, you can look it up, but it's not something I play much, but it's kind of a old game that people might be aware of, where you kind of flip tiles black and white, right? And if you control the corners, then you're inevitably going to win.
Mhm. Okay, so we look at the external world, right? That's a reason anyway. So we look at it and we have this algorithm, which is the reality construct, and the result between those two is our consciousness screen.
I don't know if I would put it exactly like that. Let me kind of talk with you about what you're saying and kind of talk it out. So in terms of the external world, that's an okay phrase, but it bears some explanation, because um, and it took me a while in life to hone in on it, right? At one point fairly early on, I had a pretty important breakthrough about thinking of it like code, right? And I sort of had like this scheme of like code, which is not exactly the same thing, but kind of deals with the, there has to be some shared code or external world or something, right? Or else different conscious individuals couldn't interact with each other or affect each other, right? Now, obviously, it is the case that we can do so. So there's some shared external world or code for external world or something that we can interface with. And I early on, meaning 20 years ago, I started to develop an idea of like, okay, so there must be code, there must be some sort of interface like that's similar to like our mind, um, and code interface, and then I guess us, right, as a conscious being. Um,
The display,
then, excuse me.
like a monitor, like our consciousness screen, and
The screen, right. That, right. So, right. So there's us. There would be our conscious screen. That's what it is. You're right. The screen, interface, and code. That's right. Exactly. And so, and a little bit like with a computer, where it could have a screen, it could have, there could be like a software code for like if there's a computer game, and then there's like the interfacing like hardware and so forth that um, takes the code and kind of is necessary to take, like if you have a computer game loaded onto your computer, but not pulled up in the RAM, but just in the computer, installed, I should say, then it's not going to show up on the screen, right? It has to be kind of interfaced with in order to show up on the screen. So that was a scheme that I had. It wasn't until much later that I refined that into understanding that the physical world was literally, and our mind, including, was literally made up of reasons. Like the fundamental matter, or metaphorically matter, that things are made up of is actually reasons, not atoms or whatever. Atoms are clearly correct on some level, just like in a computer game, there are correct kind of like if you have a computer game where someone's running, like a commando is running around with a gun in a forest, then to say that there are trees in the game, and there's areas in the game, and there's everything to do with the physics engine and how bullets work. That's all real and correct. Like if we were to say, well, fundamentally it's a game made up of code, we wouldn't be saying that your understanding of the game itself, and the fact there's trees in the game and guns and bullets and how they travel and the physics engine, that's still real, but it's real built by code. It doesn't exist in and of itself as real. but it's another way to put it is it's accurate, right? So the idea of atoms and molecules and so forth is accurate in as much as it is accurate. Of course, Newtonian physics or whatever can break down at the quantum level and so forth. But whatever the kind of accurate, whatever is accurate about that stuff is accurate. And stuff about atoms and molecules are work so consistently, right? And clearly and coherently that I'm not in any way saying that's not inaccurate. But the world is not fundamentally made up of atoms any more than um, in a computer game world, it's not made up of trees. It's fundamentally made up of code, so to speak. And then on a different layer of reality are the trees and stuff, which exist kind of in their own way, but not fundamentally.
Yeah. When I said external reality, like I meant the code, like something fixed.
Right. The
Outside.
code, the reasons. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good.
So if we change our mind, which is changing our reality construct, given the same code, we get a different consciousness screen.
Yes. Yeah, for
Oh,
sure. And that your mind itself is made up of, kind of code and reasons and so forth. But um, but yes, yeah, certainly a change in our beliefs or perspectives would result in something different. Now there might be, and I'm sure you agree with this, but just to be clear or talk about it, um, the our consciousness screen might be mostly the same, except there could be a significant difference or a more or less significant difference if we change something in our mind or reality construct.
sure. Yeah. So the key to having nirvana in our consciousness screen is configuring those frames such that we can have bliss in the consciousness screen, right?
Yes, with one caveat or issue or question or something is this world that we're in right now, nirvana or kind of constant bliss may not be feasible. And then from that, I don't despair, but I conclude that the external world at some point can undergo a change, that there's something transitional about the way the world is now. Now, if what I'm saying is true, then the greater world, so to speak, it's still true what you're saying. It's just that there would have to be some transition, some change in something about the nature of the external world. I don't know what the reason why it's useful philosophically to what I'm saying and what you're saying. The In terms of practical application, the cool thing is we don't have to really worry. Strangely enough, we don't have to worry about whether we can achieve like nirvana, so to speak, um, with the way the external world is now, because we can certainly improve on it, right? Um, and so there's plenty of contradictions and false ideas that can be gotten rid of first. It's a metaphor is sort of like with government. Whether or not we fully get rid of government, which is sort of scary if it were to happen all at once, or we see what happened in Afghanistan when things are done like really quickly, then I don't really have much to say about how quickly we should totally dissolve government if people understood that it was a fake concept based on that there can't be such a thing as legitimate government and the way that they violate property rights and so forth. But anyone's arguments about, oh, well, but we need government for this or that. Well, here's the thing is once you realize that it's illegitimate in the first place, and once you realize about property rights of the individual, then you can immediately start scaling that, stop the kind of metastasizing cancerous growth of government, and also immediately scale back or pare away a ton of places where the government doesn't need to be. And so a lot of decisions can be made better in terms of smaller and simplistically speaking smaller. In a kind of similar way with life in general, by getting fundamental frames right, building on that, dissolving contradictions, seeing conclusions as conclusions that then you don't rubber stamp them in the same way. we start to make all sorts of pretty quick and immediate and useful improvements in our lives and the efficiency of our tasks, the effectiveness of our success in our tasks, and how we operate in relationships, right? And that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when we change our frames, you say that we do that ourselves for our free will. That was the next question, because we're now down to what we need to do, right? Which is to operate at the level of frames. And you say we open up a space by asking questions, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
constantly throughout the years that the reason why we asked that particular question was because in that time, under those circumstances, there was a reaction in our mind to ask that question, to open up that space. Why do you say that we have free will? Why do you say that?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So are you saying that before free, or not saying, but you're kind of asking about, well, it seems like, and I might have this wrong in what you're saying, what you're asking, but since you first need a sort of inspiration or red flag or something that has to come first in order for your free will to even have a chance to get started, how
Yeah,
can we say we have free will? Did I get that? I might have gotten that wrong, but how does that relate to what you're saying?
yeah, because it's kind of like I agree we are conscious and the mind is not conscious. I agree we have the power, but when we use the power, I say is determined by a combination of the code plus the frames that are already exist in our minds, right? Because we constantly see things on our consciousness screen and we act based on our consciousness screen. So basically we act based on what we see, so our actions are based on something determined.
Well, the best I can think of is that everyone has these anomalies, even just unpleasantness or, basically pain or whatever. But I think everyone has enough anomalies that, in essence, negative experiences, negative feelings, whatever, are are those red flags that everyone has. And then somehow, um, let me see if I'm thinking about this with you, but like take a mother having a child and the mother feels all this love for their young child. Um, how is it that it doesn't really occur to mothers, or and I'm not picking on women here, I just as an example, of course, fathers with the exact same boat, um, that, well, the my child's understanding of their own mind is going to be really important for their own happiness. And the better I understand my mind, like I'm now the mother or father thinking to myself, the better I understand my mind, the better I can help my child understand their mind, and the more I can, just that whole type of thing, right? About that type of understanding about mind and how it relates to just basic happiness or success or what all the things people want for their kids. For some reason, neither mothers nor fathers go there very often, where they become very interested in understanding their mind and what mistakes the mind might be making. Because once you start thinking about understanding the mind, then how does someone not say, well, I see minds making mistakes. And so, well, that's pretty important, right? Let's try to figure out what the nature of when it's predictable the mind might make mistakes or what's going on with that. And how is it that someone can love their child and not go there? Because it seems like the elephant in the room or something that's pretty big and obvious, but they don't even notice. And it's like if someone says that they're looking for something, and if someone says they love their child, then that goes hand in hand with you're looking for things that might help make them happier rather than suffer more. That's kind of what love should be, right? Or must mean. And then they're missing this at least big elephant in the room. Whether it's the number one elephant or not is I won't address that, but it's certainly a big, large elephant in the room. How is that? How can they say they're looking? In other words, how do they say that they love their child and not delve into understanding the mind and the nature of it and the mistakes and why it makes mistakes and how to figure out how to have less pervasive mistakes of the mind in all sorts of ways. My point in bringing all that up is the red flags to make their free will possible to use seem to be there. And so it would seem more like they're not using their free will rather than that the circumstances or the external world or their interface or their reality construct is not giving them the red flags.
I wouldn't say that the reality construct is giving them the red flags, right? Because red flags have to be a conscious experience. So
Yeah, no, I hear you. It's like it's a puzzle. It's like, what if, okay, so what if we say, so there's a mother, she has a child, she feels love for the child, and it never occurs to her that thinking about the mind and its potential mistakes and understanding that would make a huge potential difference in the quality of the child's life for a million reasons, right? It could help the mother's relationships and have them have a better father. It could help the mother's relationship with the child, the mother's decisions, the financial situation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Plus,
or let's say that she listened to you and she knew that this is the way to maximize the goodness, right? But the moment she remembered to use the law of implication was determined by memory. So again, she knew that, but the moment she remembered it was determined by the mind's configuration.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's like, to what extent do does a person have free will? Like on let me see what Dave Mazaros writes here. It seems like this points to what Dave was talking about having a fundamental switch of seeking understanding. Elia says, David, I'd like to ask a question. Given God exists and it's provable, are there beings beyond what we can normally see, like angels or bad spirits? I don't know the answer to that about angels and bad spirits. But there's kind of nothing for or against. It's kind of a neutral question, if that makes sense, given that God exists. But sorry, I don't mean to. I want to stick with what you're saying, Mahai. I'm just taking a look in case anyone has any insight here, and just looking at things. But yeah. So one thing I pointed about angels or bad spirits is they either have free will or they don't, right? And if they don't have free will, then they're basically like algorithms. So it's not really relevant that they're an angel or a bad spirit. And if they do have free will, then they're like tantamount to people, I guess, with different physical bodies. So what we don't want to do is think that you can have like neither, right? Like either they have free will or they don't. And if they have free will, they can kind of choose goodness or not and that sort of thing. And if they don't have free will, if they just have to be bad or just have to be good, then they're no different than like an algorithm or like a physical force of some sort. Elias says, or I feel highly compelled to spend time on this question. David, is it provable and do you think it's worth spending time on it to consider it? I'm sorry if it's not tightly relevant. No, I mean, it might be great if you figure it out. Like I'd love people working on different stuff. I find the idea, it's not the same thing, but of like magic or Peter walking on water as reported in the Gospels, that sort of thing. I find that kind of interesting, and I haven't made any progress on understanding that stuff. But I find it, if someone figures it out, I'd love for them to show me or tell me how it's done. So I don't feel compelled to think too much about angels, but I do think about magic here and there. But I don't have any insight into it, unfortunately. I haven't figured anything out. Megan says, it seems to me our power lies in questioning. Yeah, I mean, we can speculate. It's a little bit speculation. It's a little bit like though looking at the opposite. So when it comes to that, back to your issue, Maya, about with free will and does something have to happen before we have free will? Well, so another way to look at it is like if someone has full on dementia or if someone just doesn't have a mind at all, right? Then there really is no one there and they don't have free will. Like free will definitely requires a certain like lattice work, like LATTICE work, which would be like it requires some scaffolding. I might be using words that aren't great for someone from Romania, but um, it or a non-native speaker, I mean, of English, but it requires uh, some mechanism, some brain in essence, or brain-like thing. And so if in our thought experiment we remove too much of the brain, then we could theoretically remove the free will. If it's thresholdish, if there's kind of a point where you have to get to enough stuff going on where you have the possibility. And it's something I thought about a lot in the past. I haven't thought about a lot recently, just as on a practical level. Just I haven't. I don't mean that I shouldn't have or I should have, but I guess I reached a level where I was pretty satisfied with it. But on the other hand, or that there were other priorities, but I could come back to it more, where like really honing in on the nature of free will, what exactly the sort of necessary ingredients are for it, where it kind of starts, like what's that little tiny spark, what's the tiniest spark of it, what's the place where it gets kind of bootstrapped, right, or made possible. And Megan kind of is referring to that type of thing here with what you're paralyzing questioning. It's a choice to question. Would it be connected to opening questions? Yeah, I think it's connected to that,
But what I would say about opening question is, how do you open a question? And like you get the inspiration to open that question in a particular moment when the mind gave you the inspiration to open the question.
Well, Jesus talks about faith. What if we ask about the idea of, and I use Jesus and Jesus' words for inspiration. I don't use it for like conclusions. I'm not saying someone should or shouldn't, but I don't, I wouldn't like just go do something because my interpretation of Jesus saying something, it was that. But anyhow, but I do use it for kind of inspiration. So he talked about faith a lot, and it just, I thought of it when you mentioned what you said and what I was thinking. So what if you take any person and they have the capacity to start thinking, all right, I want things to be better. What, again, it relates to a question and understanding. What if I could understand something more? What if there's something I'm missing? Like and now I'm thinking of humility, right? A certain type of humility. As we start, as LOI people, so to speak, we might start to notice this very powerful arrogance that people have, which is related to what I call the defense against the defense and alchemy, right, and so forth. But function, and I don't mean this like condescendingly or judgmentally, but more as a practical matter. So where the minute they disagree with you or you disagree with them, they're sure that they're right, and they don't even think of it as disagreement, but they'll just be like, well, that's not important, or well, or that's wrong, or why are you talking about that, right? That's like a disagreement that they don't even realize a disagreement. It's like a disagreement about whether you should even be talking about something. So a sort of humility that goes along with a questioning, a humility about maybe I don't already know everything about what can be better, right? And a sort of questioning of some sort. So, but I agree, it's hard to put our finger on exactly of where, and it's a very important question. One I've worked on a good amount, but as we can see, I haven't. I think I've narrowed it down to kind of the right area, but it's hard for us to put our finger on. Hard for me, might not be hard for someone else, but like yeah, like where does it begin with somebody? It's why I'm interested in hearing people's kind of origin stories with LOI, is to hear where they began with you and Dave Mazzara. You had really asked a lot of these questions. You're looking for these you had the questions, were looking for answers, with a good background kind of before you came to me. And so what about someone that isn't there? How do we help with that spark if possible?
Because you said that we always operate on our current level of understanding, which is to say we operate on a reality construct. And then you said, okay, how can we build this reality construct properly?
Mm-hmm.
And that's huge, right? But when we decide to build on the reality construct, like, you know, I'm blurry on when do we actually intervene with our free will or not? Like, are we the ones that we decided to intervene? Like, because Schopenhauer said, like, you know, we can't change what we want, but as you said, we can change what we want through some changing of the frames. But then can we change, when do we want to change the frames? Like, you see what I mean?
There's something about a humility and questioning about that has to do with like our own understanding, right? For what can make things better. Like our free will is really close to what I'm describing here. And anyone that does this is, in essence, the longer they do it, the more the reality construct is going to get aligned with what's accurate, and therefore what'll lead to more good, right? Is this, like, for any person, the spark again is going to look like, well, I want better for myself or someone else. I care about someone, myself and or some other person, or many other people. And what if I wasn't totally arrogant about the idea that I already know exactly what needs to happen or who to blame or whatever, in order for things to be better? What if an increase in my own understanding, including maybe there's some wrong ideas in my mind, or maybe there's some right ideas that I don't have, and I want those, right? Something like that is like the spark or the salvation question, so to speak, right? That it's the paradigm shift. That if people have it, um, uh, ironically, the answers are somewhat sorry. That a lot of the answers are somewhat easy, given that we have LOI now, and given what I've discovered and what other people have been working on. But yeah, it's that spark that I think that's pretty close to our free will, is like this desire for better, a faith in better, but a faith in better relating to humility, which is related to understanding, right? Not just a faith in better where it's like, if only every person of a certain race would do better, or if only government would do better, or if only this community would do this, or if people would care more. Like something that's not about blaming or some kind of mechanized or action or environmental shift, but something to do with, if I myself gained understanding, um, which could involve me learning I'm wrong about something, not just getting just the solution handed to me. Something like that, where it's like a space, a creative space.
I was thinking about focus. Do you think focus is related to free will?
Yeah, I think it flows, because when you like, another thing that's really close to free will is when you question a mind's conclusion, right? Remember, one also mental image that I've given people is, suppose you're like the president of could be a country, could be a corporation or whatever, and you have advisors, but your only inputs are from the advisors. So they can sort of paint a certain picture, they can leave out information. You only can talk to the advisors, and then you make decisions, but they're like, it's like you're the rider on the elephant, like where the elephant is kind of the powerful one and you're just the rider. But you could change things by asking a certain type of question where you were kind of catching them in contradictions, or working through things, or not rubber stamping their assumptions or conclusions, which is similar. Right, an assumption is conclusion is in as much as it's like you're assuming that certain thing is true and working off of that, right? That's a conclusion. So if you refuse to rubber stamp one of their conclusions, then you're forcing them to like give you more information and so forth. What's that? That's more focus, right, in that area. So it's like that with you and your brain, where when you refuse to rubber stamp, you're getting real close to the core of your free will. You're still limited in your inputs by what your mind's going to give you or your reality construct, but you're opening something up and causing more focus in that area, more zooming in, right? More level of potential detail, to spot contradictions and so forth. And so that's how I think how free focus and free will are related.
But if we take two scenarios, one in which the advisors gave you something and you rubber stamped, and one in which the advisors gave you something and you didn't rubber stamp, there
Uh-huh.
has to be distinction that makes you in some instance rubber stamp and in some instance not rubber stamp. That
Right,
distinct
like what comes before that, and that your process right there was awesome, like in every way, like you did, but not just the scenarios, but saying like there has to be a reason, like that. That's how I dig. That's how I get to these foundational frames. Is exactly what you just did. You know, is like, well, there has to be a reason for that. What's causing it? Um,
I was thinking that is the mind as well. That's why I say we have no free will.
we have free will because the opposite is absurd. Um, and here's where it is. Like, so the thing that can spark it though is your advisor, and as we relate this to the mind, remember the mind is not conscious. So in the advisor mental image, the advisors are conscious, just in the sense of the advisors are, you know, people in our mental image. But with our mind, it's not conscious. So here's how we can start to see how free will interacts with our mind, but our mind can't have free will. So our mind is giving us like, okay, here's the situation, here's the conclusion, here's what you should do. You know, you have this goal and this is what's going to make you progress towards it, right? And so go do it. And so let's now, as a conscious person, we're the only one that can see bad, that can experience bad. Your mind can't actually experience bad. To your mind, right, the the dried milk, so to speak, where it takes the consciousness out of it. To your mind, goodness is just that which is associated with progress towards goals. It's a totally different sense of goodness. To you, consciously, you're experiencing badness sometimes. And faith would be the idea that it doesn't have to be that way. That and so your mind is basically telling you, no, you have to experience bad. Like there's this task, you have to do it, and it has to be bad. And you're like, wait, no, bad. I have faith in good. There's something that we haven't explored yet. There's some question I have because you're telling me bad is good. You're right, like you're talking to your mind, so to speak. You can't actually talk to your mind, but the talking kind of happens as you spark more focus, or you know, you don't rubber stamp. But metaphorically speaking, you're talking to your mind. Mind, you're telling me bad is good. So okay, so this is good. This has brought me to something that I've kind of thought of it in the past, but you're kind of sparking both the memory and maybe honing something for me, and then hopefully for other people. The fundamental contradiction that you as a conscious being can start, that can spark everything and continue to spark things, the fundamental red flag is that bad is good. You're presented with that conclusion by your mind.
Yeah,
And the
like
reason,
no
right?
problem.
And
That's bad. Like continue cutting your hand or something like that.
well, the way it works is that the reason why it's possible for you to be, of course we experience it, but the reason why we're able to experience bad is good is because that conclusion is because there's two different meanings of bad and good, one to you as a conscious being and one to your mind. So your mind is saying this will help us further your goals. Also, our mind can have all kinds of contradictory beliefs in it at the same time. It's our mind's fully capable of having contradictory thoughts and beliefs because our reality contract is built kind of from the surface downward, not other way around. Anyway, so our mind is like, all right, the following thing is associated with progress. We need to do it, or I, you know, you need to do it. I need to do it. Right? Your mind is talking as if it's you. And so it's telling you need to do something. Therefore, it's good, but it's also letting you know you're not going to like it. Right? It's going to involve suffering and so forth, but you got to do it. But you can feel the suffering consciously, right? But to your mind might have like cognitive dissonance, which means that when these contradictions come up between it, it's sense that there's badness associated with it, but there's also goodness, and the goodness outweighs the badness, so to speak. That's kind of how your mind calculates these things. But anyway, so bad is good. And then at some point, to help it to wake up, you have to refuse to have faith, or you have to have faith in goodness, which means that the bad is not good, but that there's something that's not understood, something wrong. And so you want more of something like understanding, because that can't be right. And that's kind of the seat, the fundamental thing in your of your free will, is to not rubber stamp that bad is good, and to have faith in goodness.
It's kind of like you have a mental object that has both the quality of progress, which feels good, and also the quality of something bad, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And then,
That's when you want to say, wait, I want more understanding.
but again, you know, like the reason why you say I want more understanding in one case rather than the other is because there's a threshold of there being more conscious bad than progress.
I don't know. The thing with free will is that it has to not be stopped. It's not something that your mind can fully stop. Now, certainly, as you exercise free will or something or other, there's certainly some things that are just easier. Sorry, it's really, I should put it in the opposite way. There's times when it's harder to like fight your mind than others. So exercising your free will at first can result in the most oppressive it'll ever be from your mind, in terms of its blowback, or what the lift is kind of maybe hardest in the beginning, and then the lift gets easier and easier and easier as you exercise your free will more. um, Everything's easier. So the initial lift is very difficult, and then it automatically has to become less and less difficult as you exercise it more. The reason it becomes less difficult is because um, your mind reorients, like your reality contract changes so that it's more accurate, it's more right, and it will have the memory, even maybe of you being better off from questioning something, and all that sort of thing. But it can't be the initiation of your free will can't be limited by your mind. However, the possibility of you having free will needs to be thresholdish. In other words, you either have free will or you don't. You need the requisite apparatus, stuff, machine, mechanism, mind, to be able to have free will. But at the point where you do have it, then you have it and you can use it, and nothing can stop you from using it. Not your mind, or whatever. But the blowback, your mind can give you like a feeling of emotional pain or exhaustion from using it, but it can't actually stop you or make it possible. Sorry, it can make it possible. Your mind doesn't make it possible. The creation of one's mind is such that if there's enough stuff there, it would have to be possible. At the point when you have any free will whatsoever, the idea of free will or power, we're so used to identifying with our mind and our body, where power is like variable. You can have more power, less power, and you can feel kind of more or less exhausted. But actual power or free will that's inherent to you as a being, if it's inherent to you as a being, it can't be enabled or stopped by something else, or you don't actually have the power. The other, whatever could enable it or stop it, would.
So we have it from the moment we wake up till the moment we go asleep.
If it's there, well, I'm saying if it's there, it's there. If it's not there, everything's absurd, right? Like looking at it from the opposite, we can narrow it down to we have to have it. Like we have to have it. If we're sorry, we have to have it, or if there's ever a time when we don't have free will, then kind of any idea of action or anything like that is totally absurd. It doesn't really exist. Like there's no meaning to anything. There's no whatever. Like you literally don't have free will, so just whatever happens, happens, right?
And I would say you don't even have a consciousness screen, right?
Uh, maybe it's possible. It might not exist in reality, but maybe it's possible for there to be a consciousness screen, but no free will if certain other parts of what's necessary for free will are missing. But since we're not in that circumstance, it's not. It's. I agree. This is a very important topic in general, and thinking around it is useful, potentially useful. But some things that are counterfactual like that aren't. Like clearly we do have a consciousness screen. So, like for example, wondering whether animals have a consciousness screen is not something I put a lot of focus into. Um, but just because it's not like the immediate bottleneck, so to speak. But I don't mind. Anyone else could think about it more if they wanted to. But remember the thing about the opposite being absurd. You don't have to figure out what your free will is in order to know that it's there. It has to be there.
I mean, I was thinking like the opposite. Like, what would it mean not to have free will? And
Oh, great question. Yeah, that's a great way, or a great way to part of the thinking process. It's part of what I definitely did that same question and exercise for myself.
yeah, and some people say that maybe free will is an illusion. So they're questioning the very fact that we
Yeah, I
have
know.
this sense.
But
And
everything immediately goes to absurdity. Like the thing that I realized when I asked that question was there's no meaning to anything. If you don't have free will, you can't even think about whether you have free will. So you're not actually doing so. So you might as well just you do whatever, right? I mean, you do or don't because you can't do, right? So there's an absurdity at every corner. So I realized that wasn't the case.
yeah,
Free
like
will is not an illusion.
what would be the opposite of not having a free will? Like something very, very close to what we're experiencing right now.
Again, now I don't mean this in any way dismissively, but literally to literally answer your question. Uh, if we don't have free will, there's nothing could be close to it. It just would be absurd. Like there's no meaning. We're not even thinking right now. Like we don't need to make any decisions. There's nothing we need to do or could do. It's all irrelevant if we don't have free will.
What if this consciousness screen that we're experiencing is a movie and we're watching it, and the very fact that we're not questioning whether we're viewers or not is because we're limited to not asking that question, right? It's as if we forgot that we're watching a movie.
And that there's yet another angle besides the direct angle on it being absurd is for God to create a world where we're totally helpless and yet have bad is odd. And then someone could say, well, maybe we need to experience some bad in order to experience good. I don't really buy that. Like it could still be less, right? I mean, I don't know. Again, it's um, I still think that the question is answered by realizing that everything's meaningless and absurd if there's no free will. So we might as well act on the idea that there is. And like the whole scheme about life that I have is so coherent, right? Like it kind of all fits together and makes sense. Um, even if it gets a little vague or hard to understand when it comes to free will. But even then, I mean, we're pretty close. Like we're pretty close to the answer where it can't be stopped. Like I know a lot of the features that free will has to have, like I've mentioned. Has to do with seeking understanding. It can't be stopped. What did I just say recently? Like this idea of of not having faith in bad, but having faith in good. It's all right there. And then if you say, well, what if we just don't have it? It's like if I show how government can't be legitimate, and then someone says, well, what if it is legitimate? It's sort of just denying the absurdity that we just already talked about. It seems to me.
Hmm. You said that so we have a consciousness screen and I am the observer of the consciousness screen.
Uh-huh.
But why does the I have to exist? Because like this is a stipulation, and with the stipulation, like you constructed a lot of things, right? but I don't think you ever explained the stipulation.
Well, because I don't see it as a stipulation. With your consciousness screen existing, that is the foundation of your knowledge. That's your foundation of your philosophy. Everything else we think about and construct is based on the idea that if we separate out the conclusions from our consciousness screen, then anything that seems to be in our conscious screen, it's true that it seems to be, however we want to put it, right? But so where people make mistakes when they try to get foundational but screw up has to do with substitute or adding in conclusions in their consciousness screen and then confusing that with the consciousness screen itself, or the kind of the raw experience of the consciousness screen, and then showing how those conclusions could be possibly wrong, and therefore maybe we don't really have a conscious screen, maybe we're wrong about that. But the consciousness screen is fundamental. It's not a stipulation. And
Uh,
then, yeah.
the reason why I say it's a stipulation is because when you defined the conscious screen, you said that it's the totality of things that you experience or see, hear, whatever
Right,
in a
like in the moment. Yeah.
And when you define that, by definition, you stipulated the I, the possessiveness, right? Because you experience. You can't say consciousness screen without implying an I. That, you know, because
Well, yeah, I'm thinking, though, I think if we look at what we're saying here, and I mean we, not just you or myself, but the reason there's an implication of an I, like a conscious being you, in addition to the consciousness screen, it isn't so much a stipulation or an assumption or whatever, or one logically leads to the other. Well, sorry, the existence of a being doesn't logically lead to a consciousness screen, but if we start with a consciousness screen, then I would say you're right that it implies there's an I, a being who's aware of the consciousness screen, but not because I defined it that way. Instead, I observe the starting point, which is my consciousness screen. And then from that, there's a necessarily logical I thing of some sort that is experiencing it.
yeah, but maybe you
But that's
define.
a logical conclusion, not a stipulation. It's not true by definition. It's true as an actual logical conclusion.
Yeah, but maybe you could have worded it in such a way that it wouldn't have implied an I, right? Because if you named it instead of consciousness screen, which implies an I, if you named it something else, which wouldn't imply an I, then there wouldn't be the I. So you see what I mean? Like,
I'm following you, I believe, but how is, I don't know why the wording is relevant, or what kind of wording wouldn't lead to the conclusion of an I.
the screen implies an observer, but if you named whatever we experience, well, I can't say because I say what we experience, but if you named it something else, like a door, there wouldn't be an observer, right?
Okay, so if we use the word like Fred to or Bunga, I won't have to use a proper person's name.
Yeah, if
So
we
if
use
we
it implies that Fred has a mother in the same sense that if you say screen, it implies it has an observer.
Okay, so let's make up a word, GAR, G-A-R. Okay, so GAR is a conscious, you see, like the idea of a conscious of a GAR, but of what we were calling a conscious screen, without something being aware of the consciousness screen. I agree that I think there's something, I think there's an answer to this, and I think I or you or anyone else could do better with an answer to what you're saying. Um, I do think, that doesn't mean that it's true, but I do think that there is a better answer. Like I think you're pushing, I think in practice, what you'll end up doing is pushing us to explain this even better, perhaps. But I don't think there's any possibility or worry that there's no I there that's aware of GAR, the formerly known as the consciousness screen.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
not worried
because
about that at all.
everything ties in with what's the power, whether or not this is a movie and we're watching it and we're getting on the movie, the sense that we have a power rather than not having a power.
I
The sense,
also just experience constantly that, like, I don't know, just the idea that we have no free will whatsoever. I don't know. It does. Besides it being absurd on the face of itself, it just it's so coherent to our experience that we um, can seek understanding and gain it, like it, and and so forth. Let me see what people are saying, by the way, because we're kind of having this conversation with ourselves. We're also a little bit going to be out of time. So this shows that there's a lot of richness to these discussions. So I'll almost certainly do one in 2 weeks, just because I won't have to worry that it won't keep going. So I think that we have more, to discuss. So we can continue to talk in 2 weeks. Let's see here. Let me just do a little bit of a lot of good discussion about this. Almost don't even know where to start looking. Elias said, my LOI started in the toilet. I like it. Asking, why isn't the world perfect? Right? Which relates to the faith and goodness as a small child, as my sisters and brothers hammered on the door telling me to hurry up. That's really funny. But what's interesting is that reflects what I postulated, so to speak, is it's why isn't, like, why isn't there more good? But if we ask that in sort of a humble way, in the right way, there's a way to ask that in terms of just giving up or complaining, or there's a way to ask in terms of seeking, right? So something about the imperfection of the world caused Elios, or I don't know if cause is not necessarily the right word, but sparked or was related to Elios, his reaction to it. See, that's where I feel like the free will is. It's like we're confronted with bad is good or the world isn't good enough. And do we react in kind of a seeking, humble, faithful way, faith and goodness way? Or do we do the opposite of faith and just say, well, it's this person's fault, or I just have to do better, like something like, but do better, not in terms of seeking understanding, but just struggle more, fight more. You're not believing in goodness. You're not, right? You're not believing in seeking. You just believe in fighting and struggling or blaming or whatever, but something other than seeking in the right, seeking goodness. Peter writes, what impact does we experiencing something have in the processing of our mind? Oh, that's another good type of question. And it's the kind of thing I've asked and it helps shape things. Not that I have a perfect answer to it, but it's the kind of question that leads to like the sorts of thoughts that are helpful. What impact is we experiencing something have on the processing of our mind? Is there a direct feedback loop? What I actually think is that is correct is that our mind is not in a feedback loop with our consciousness field. It's in a feedback loop like with the environment, but what shows up in our consciousness field can cause us to turn on our free will and not rubber stamp something, seek and open up a space. And that creates like a small ripple, so to speak, a small adjustment or a space being opened up that can then have a big kind of butterfly effect or whatever, not even in an unpredictable or chaotic way, but more like a kind of a predictable way, where it opens up a question in our mind, and then that creates a situation where it affects both our mind and then could affect the environment and so forth. But I actually don't think there's a feedback loop other than that, other than the opportunity for our free will to be exercised by not rubber stamping a conclusion. But it's almost like we continually have this small ability to not rubber stamp certain things. Whereas on the other hand, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in your mind that you don't have the opportunity. I'm going to use a double negative here. You don't have the opportunity to not rubber stamp. Like in other words, you can't open up a space or question everything in your mind at any moment. But certain things will come up for review, so to speak, or or even again, the smallest crack will open up that you can put a wedge in the crack, and that'll, break the dam, so to speak, over time. But that's how a little indication of there. I'm doing a little bit of a speed round here. What do you mean by CS consciousness screen? So saying something like having the right question is a semi-soft lock, is the power to attract an answer to the win. Yeah, that as a model, it's a little bit like having the right questions is a little bit like the atomic molecular model. It's very accurate and correct and practical. When we're asking the most fundamental question about our free will, that the right question is like a symptom of free will, but not the free will itself, like having the right question. So it's not the most deep thing, but it's certainly in a practical way very relevant to have the model of having the right question. It's like a semi-soft lock. And then I'll about to close here, but Elios, but David, as you have clarity on what is good, important, and true, you wouldn't have two versions of good. Like are you talking, Elias, here about how I say your mind has one version of good, where it's like that which furthers goals? The thing about your mind not being conscious is, in a certain way, that's always going to be the case, right? There's no amount of enlightenment that's going to cause your mind to be conscious. Enlightenment is more like your mind, like you can have it encoded in your mind that it's not conscious, with a sort of red flag that pops up whenever it's relevant, to correct for your mind not being conscious. And on a practical level, what'll happen is like basically your goals and your feelings about your goals get more and more kind of straightened out, where like the in another way to put it is what your mind, and therefore you, feel is progress will be more aligned with actual progress. Like what, in other words, as your mind gets more integrated with correct ideas, your feelings about what's good will line up with what's actually good more and more. By definition, by logic, or by definition, maybe not by definition, but by logic, the more accurate the ideas in your mind, which will happen over time, right? The more your feelings will line up accurately with goodness, progress, and so forth. That's just kind of a logical consequence, and of course, a very nice consequence. I don't use the terminology becoming more conscious. It's a terminology that's out there and used in other teachings and other teachers. It might be a nitpick, it might be relevant, depending on the concept. A certain distinction is important here. I'm never trying to be like, you can't talk this way. It's never about the wording isn't the primary thing that I have an issue with, right? But it's important to realize in a certain concept that you can't be more conscious. You can use your free will more consistently to have faith in goodness, right? So whenever your mind comes up with to be able to better spot when your mind is showing you saying that good is bad or bad is good. It's why any kind of greater good theory, right, is not tempting to me, right? Because I don't have having faith in goodness means you don't need to like break a few eggs. In other words, people, right? Individuals. Breaking eggs is okay, actual eggs, but breaking people is not okay. Violating people is not okay, just because you suppose that's going to supposedly lead to more goodness, right? You can easily come up with a scheme where we enslave 1% of the population and force them to become healthcare workers, or even give massages to the rest of us, right? And you just sacrifice the 1%, and all the rest, the other 99% are better off, right? But of course, that's not tempting. Anyway, that's but I don't think of us being more conscious. Instead, or more aware. anyway, but then you say separate from your terminology, the more free will you use and the less you flow down. I think it's, I agree as we're talking about here, and as Mahai as so well kind of pointed out, like it gets hard to spot free will, and if it becomes easier, like I think free will becomes easier to use. You know, it's like free will itself is not really a struggle. Like we're so used to identifying effort or power or doing stuff with like a mental or physical effort that can be easier or not easy. I'm pretty sure, or maybe very sure, I'm just however to put it, like in the moment, I'm pretty sure we could probably hone in on it, but it all takes time to where it's very clear that free will, using your free will is not something that is more or less difficult. It's actually literally effortless. Like nothing can stop the free will, but it could be accompanied by more or less feeling of emotional pain or exhaustion or your mind rebelling. And probably the more you use it, the less your mind rebels. And so that's how it feels like it's easier to use. But it's actually isn't the sort of thing that can be necessarily hard or easy. But what's that initial spark is one that I'm honing in on, but there's probably something more that we can figure out about that. And it might be like, the biggest bottleneck right now is what's that spark for ourselves and for other people. So I could really applaud Mahai, besides thank you very much, Mahai, but also honing in on this kind of question as really the bottleneck at this point in time, where we're getting to that spark of free will. Where what exactly is it, and then questions related to that. I think it makes sense, and people are interested. People are really sparking a lot of discussion here. Roberto says, I've given this some thought and almost always come up with this distinction of free will versus consequential will. Interesting. Because the only thing we're free to do is choose. I don't, however, think that means we have free will. It's more like consequential with the ability to choose. That seems to fit more reality. This is interesting. Hopefully, if you're able, I know you're not always able to come on at this time, Roberto, but I think we want to explore what you're saying more, one way or the other. And it's a little bit hard to do that right at this moment. Okay, just for time's sake and so forth, and looks like Peter has a nice diagram here too. So let's continue this basically in 2 weeks. What do you think? And thank you, Mahai, for coming on.
Thank you as well.
I know we're just kind of a bit arbitrarily ending it here, but just for time's sake.
Yeah, I just want to say that like the effects that the law of implication has on business, relationships, and everything is amazing, right?
Awesome.
It's game changing, and the reason why it's game changing is because we operate on a fundamental level, like we discussed, like we go down to the frames themselves, right? And
Yeah.
we could perfect them in such a way that we could surpass geniuses, like in strategy and in resource management and stuff like that, right? And then you talked about how we can modify those frames, right? You gave the formula of R equals X times Y, and in your frame series. And that when I first heard that, I was like, it blew my mind, because I thought that, oh my God, I can recreate reality, because I can recreate the way I see, the way I feel. I can recreate progress and all that.
What were the X and Y in R equals X times Y?
You think about the result that you want, and the Y is the frame that you have. And the more you understand about the R, the result, and the more you understand about the frame that you already have, the more X reveals itself. And
Oh,
it's
nice. Okay, great.
it's kind of like a way that you start with the result in mind, and then you construct the frame necessary to get to that result, right? And so basically, when throughout your webinars, you showed us both a way that you could figure out the result that you want in life, but you also told us how important it is to understand the results that we want in our lives, right? Like one
Yeah.
level more meta. And as long as we understand what results we want and how to get those results, then we're pretty much set for everything, right? But
Yeah.
like figure out like what's our power, because then like you covered everything, but this power element, like if we could figure this out as well, like we have all everything, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love it. I agree. And this is something I've worked on for years, of course, but no, this is great to help focus me on and push further. And that's the kind of thing I really appreciate. I don't, and that I don't have as much in my life, just without you guys, you know. So just like any of us. So the way that you help push me with this topic is terrific. I appreciate that. And yeah, let's just basically continue. If you're here in 2 weeks, then we'll continue, and we'll continue with everyone else too. I might even pull this. Maybe maybe I don't know, but I might want to look at these comments again next webinar. Might even stay in the same, somehow think about staying in the same chat, like go into the, I'll look at how the events might work, whatever. But anyway, we'll figure it out. But I don't want this chat, and I'll try to review the chat a bit, because good, yeah, this is kind of pushing us to hone in on the free will even better, and then that can lead to ripple effects. And just to rephrase what you're saying with the R and the X and the Y, is like if you keep in mind the result that you want, and then you keep asking yourself what contextual elements, what changes in the environment, or what actions could you take, whatever, that would help make the result like more easy, efficient, likely, that sort of thing. Then you keep like, yeah, filling things in until you're kind of just, it all kind of becomes clear how to finish getting it. So yeah, I use that in a practical way all the time too, and it leads to different thoughts than normal when people go through achieving things.
Yeah, like you called it, like genius on command.
Genius on demand. I love it. Brilliance on demand. Um, you added moments of happiness I never thought I'd have. That's wonderful. Hell yes, I'm so glad. Peace to you all, and thank you. Yep, thank you very much. Awesome, guys. Well, wonderful, unbelievable participation and discussion. And I'll see you all, or whoever can come on, in 2 weeks. Take care, everyone.
Thanks very much for
Very
everything that
welcome.
you
Awesome.
and